I had spent years making sure nobody could hurt me, and then I almost pushed away the one person who never tried to. Eira arrived at my ranch with nothing but 2 old trunks and a recipe book, but somehow she changed the way my own workers looked at me. The first thing the ranch hands noticed was that the dining room in town had become empty. For almost 8 years, every evening after the sun went down, the men from Blackthorn Ranch walked through the wooden doors of the same small restaurant near the old train station. They sat at the same tables, ordered the same meals, and complained about the same things. Then, one Monday night, nobody came. The owner of the restaurant, a man named Orson Bellamy, stood behind the counter looking at the empty chairs. He checked the clock twice, thinking maybe the workers were late. They were never late. Blackthorn Ranch was known for strict routines. The horses were fed at the same hour, the fences were checked before sunrise, and the men finished their work before the first stars appeared. But that night, every one of them stayed at the ranch, and the reason was a woman nobody expected to see there. Her name was Eira Whitlock. When people in town first heard that Silas Crowe was getting married, most of them assumed the woman would be someone from a wealthy family, someone who understood parties, expensive clothes, and the quiet rules that followed men with influence. Silas had a reputation that reached far beyond the valley. Some called him a businessman, others called him something else. He owned several ranches, controlled transportation routes between towns, and had connections with men who preferred solving problems without involving the law. People lowered their voices when they spoke about him. Nobody accused Silas directly of anything, but nobody asked too many questions either. He had built his name during a difficult time when honesty alone was not always enough to survive. At 39 years old, Silas had everything people believed a man should want: money, land, respect, fear. But he lived alone in a large house at the center of Blackthorn Ranch, surrounded by workers who followed orders but rarely spoke to him about anything personal. His first wife had died years before, leaving behind a silence that never fully disappeared. After that, Silas stopped allowing people to get close, until he met Eira. She was not what anyone expected. She did not arrive wearing expensive dresses. She did not come with a family name that opened doors. She arrived with 2 old trunks, a simple brown coat, and a small bag filled with handwritten recipes from her mother. The first time Silas saw her, she was standing outside a small boarding house, arguing with the owner because he had increased the price of her room. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked at the man and explained that a promise was still a promise, even when nobody was watching. Silas happened to be passing by. He listened. Most people avoided confrontation with strangers, especially when they needed something. Eira did the opposite. She stood there calmly, holding her ground. Silas respected that. Their courtship was not a story people would tell at celebrations. There were no grand gestures, no musicians, no public declarations. They spoke during short visits, usually while Silas handled business in town. Eira knew very little about his world. She knew he was wealthy. She knew people treated him differently, but she did not know the full weight of his reputation. When he asked her to marry him, she did not answer immediately. She asked one question: "Do you want a wife, or do you want someone to manage your house?" Silas had never heard anyone speak to him that way. He could have been offended. Instead, he thought about the question for several days, because he knew she was right. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who obeyed him. He was not used to someone asking what he truly wanted. Eventually, he told her the truth. "I don't know how to have a normal life anymore." Eira looked at him and replied, "Then maybe you should learn." That was why she became Mrs. Crowe. Not because she was impressed by his money, not because she wanted the security. She married him because she believed a person could change if they were willing to admit what was wrong. The workers at Blackthorn Ranch were not convinced. The morning Eira arrived, several ranch hands watched from a distance. They expected a woman who would complain about dust, horses, and the smell of the stables. Instead, she walked into the kitchen. She opened the cabinets, checked the supplies, asked where the flour was stored. Nobody understood what she was doing. One of the oldest workers, Bram Holloway, leaned against the door and said, "Ma'am, the cook usually comes in from town." Eira looked at him. Not anymore. Bram thought she was joking. She was not. By noon, the entire ranch smelled different. The men who worked outside came inside expecting the usual food they had eaten for years. Instead, they found bowls of stew, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and coffee prepared before they even asked. Nobody said much. The workers were not the type of men who praised easily. But the next day they finished every plate. The third day, nobody mentioned going into town for dinner. The change happened quietly. That was what surprised everyone. Eira did not try to impress them. She did not act like she was trying to become the owner of the ranch. She simply noticed things. She noticed that Bram always sat near the window because his knees hurt when he stayed in one position too long. She noticed that young Corwin Hale never ate dessert because he sent his extra money home to his younger siblings. She noticed that the stable worker, Merritt Vale, drank his coffee without sugar because he thought nobody cared enough to remember how he liked it. Small things. Things that people often ignored. The ranch hands had worked under powerful men before. Most bosses cared about results. Eira cared about people, and that was something they did not know how to handle. Silas noticed the difference too. Before Eira arrived, his house had been quiet. Too quiet. Now there was movement. The sound of plates in the kitchen. The sound of conversations. The sound of someone opening windows in rooms that had been closed for years. But Silas also noticed something else. His workers were becoming less afraid of him. At first that bothered him. He was used to distance. Distance was easier. Fear was predictable. Respect was more complicated. One evening he walked into the kitchen and found Eira preparing tomorrow's bread. She looked tired, not unhappy, just tired. "You don't need to do all of this," Silas said. Eira continued kneading the dough. "I know." "Then why do you?" She looked at him. "Because everyone here acts like they are waiting for something bad to happen." Silas did not answer. Because she had noticed something he had spent years hiding. The men at Blackthorn Ranch were loyal, but loyalty built on fear had limits. Eira was changing the atmosphere of the place without demanding anything. That frightened Silas more than any enemy, because he knew kindness could reveal things that power kept hidden. A few weeks later, the town started talking. People wondered why the ranch hands stopped eating at the restaurant. Some assumed Eira was trying to control the ranch. Others believed she was only pretending to be different. The rumors grew, and one man paid close attention. His name was Thaddeus Marlowe. He had worked with Silas years before. They were once partners in business, but after a disagreement, Silas walked away and built his own empire. Thaddeus never accepted that. He believed Silas had taken something from him. Now, seeing a woman with no powerful family name entering Blackthorn Ranch, he saw an opportunity. He knew Silas had one weakness, not money, not enemies, trust, and Thaddeus planned to use it, because he understood something that others did not. The easiest way to destroy a strong man was not to attack him directly. It was to make him doubt the person standing beside him. And Eira Whitlock had just become the closest person to Silas Crowe. Thaddeus Marlowe did not rush his plans. He had learned many years before that people made mistakes when they acted too quickly. Silas Crowe was not a man who could be challenged with simple threats. He had survived too many difficult situations to be easily frightened, but everyone had something they wanted to protect. For Silas, that thing was no longer his land or his money. It was Eira. Thaddeus began by asking questions around town. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would make people suspicious. He sat in the same places where farmers and merchants gathered after work and listened. People talked when they thought nobody important was paying attention. Some said Eira was changing the ranch. Some said Silas seemed different. Others said a man like Silas could never truly change. Thaddeus listened to all of it. Then he started adding small doubts. "I wonder how long someone like her can stay in that world," he said one evening. Nobody answered. That was exactly what he wanted. A rumor did not need proof to spread. It only needed a question. At Blackthorn Ranch, life continued. Eira had become part of the daily routine. She knew which horses needed special care. She knew which workers avoided talking about their problems. She knew when Silas was carrying the weight of a difficult decision, even when he said nothing. But there was one thing she still did not know: the full truth about his past. Silas had never lied to her. He simply left parts of his life untouched. Some memories were easier to bury than explain. One night, after dinner, Eira found him sitting alone in his office. The room was filled with papers, old contracts, and letters that had never been answered. "You work until everyone else is asleep," she said. Silas looked up. "Someone has to. That is what people say when they don't know how to stop." He almost smiled. Almost. Eira walked closer and placed a cup of coffee beside him. "You think being responsible means carrying everything alone?" Silas looked at the papers. For a long time it did. She sat across from him. Maybe that was true before, but things are different now. Silas remained quiet. He knew she was right, but accepting that was difficult. For most of his life, depending on others had been a risk. People left. People betrayed. People changed sides when money was involved. Eira had not done any of those things, but part of him still expected the moment when she would. That was the part of himself he had never been able to silence. A few days later, trouble came to the ranch. A shipment of cattle supplies failed to arrive. At first, it seemed like a simple delay. Then another shipment disappeared. Silas immediately suspected someone was interfering. His workers noticed the change in him. The conversations became shorter. The house became quieter. The old Silas was returning. The man who solved problems by keeping everyone at a distance. Bram Holloway noticed it first. He had worked for Silas longer than almost anyone. One morning, he found Eira outside near the garden. "You should know something," Bram said. She turned toward him. "What is it?" "The men here respect your husband." Eira waited. "But some of them are afraid of what happens when he feels cornered." She looked toward the main house. "Has he always been like that?" Bram took a moment before answering. "No, not always." That surprised her. Bram continued. "When he was younger, he trusted people too easily. Then he learned the wrong lesson." "What lesson?" "That caring about people gives them a way to hurt you." Eira looked down at the ground. She understood then that Silas's coldness was not because he had no feelings. It was because he had spent years protecting them. That evening she tried to talk to him. The conversation did not go the way she expected. "Someone is trying to harm this ranch," Silas said. "I know. You don't know everything." "No," she answered. "But I know you." Silas stopped. "You think you do." Eira looked at him. "I know enough to see that you are becoming the person you were before." His expression changed. "You don't understand what is happening." "Then explain." Silas looked away. That was the moment Eira realized something. The hardest battles in their marriage were not against other people. They were against the things Silas refused to say. "I cannot protect you if you don't know what you are standing beside," he finally said. Eira stayed quiet. Then she replied, "I did not marry a perfect man, Silas. I married a man who said he wanted to become better." Those words stayed with him, because they reminded him of something he had forgotten. Change was not something a person promised once. It was something they chose every day. Meanwhile, Thaddeus continued working from the shadows. He found a man willing to help him. His name was Orvin Sayer. Orvin had once worked at Blackthorn Ranch but left after Silas discovered he was stealing supplies. He had been waiting years for a chance to return. Thaddeus offered him money. Orvin offered information. Together they planned something simple. They would make Silas believe Eira had a hidden reason for marrying him. They needed only one thing. A document. Something that looked real enough to create doubt. The problem was getting close to the house. But Thaddeus knew someone inside could help. He knew the workers trusted Eira, and that trust could be used against them. A week later, a letter arrived at Blackthorn Ranch. It had no sender. Silas opened it alone. Inside was a copy of an old financial agreement. The name of Eira Whitlock appeared beside a company he had never heard of. The document suggested she had known about his wealth before they met. For several minutes, Silas simply stared at the paper. His first reaction was anger. His second was confusion, because deep inside, he did not want to believe it. He wanted to ask Eira. He wanted to hear her explanation. But years of experience had trained him differently. His first instinct was always to protect himself. That night, he barely spoke during dinner. Eira noticed immediately. She asked what was wrong. Silas said nothing, and that silence hurt her more than an accusation would have, because she had spent weeks trying to show him that trust mattered. Now, when it was his turn to trust her, he stepped back. The next morning, the ranch hands noticed something was wrong. The atmosphere had changed. The same house that had slowly become warmer was becoming quiet again. Bram watched Silas leave early with the document in his pocket. He knew something had happened, and he knew one more thing. If Silas allowed suspicion to control him, he could lose the one person who had brought peace back into the ranch. That afternoon, Eira made a decision. She would not chase after Silas. She would not beg him to believe her. She had spent her life proving her character through actions, not words. But before she could decide what to do next, another problem appeared. The ranch accountant discovered missing records. Several payments had been altered, and all the evidence seemed to point in one direction, toward Eira. The missing records changed everything at Blackthorn Ranch. Until that moment, the workers had only felt that something was wrong. Now, there was a problem with proof. At least, that was what it looked like. The ranch accountant, Pelham Wexley, had spent most of his life working with numbers. He was not a man who accused people without reason. That was why his discovery created such concern. Several payments from the previous month had been moved between accounts. The amounts were not large enough to be noticed immediately, but together, they created a clear pattern. Someone had been changing records, and the name connected to the new account was Eira Whitlock. Silas called her into his office that evening, the same office where they had once talked about their future, the same room where Eira had told him he needed to learn how to live differently. This time, there was no warmth between them, only a question. "Did you know about these payments?" Eira looked at the papers on the desk. "No." Silas watched her carefully. He wanted to believe her, but the document from Thaddeus was still in his mind. The doubts had already entered. "That is your answer?" Eira looked at him. "What answer do you expect?" "I expect the truth." She stood still for a moment. Then she said, "The truth is that I did not do this." Silas looked away. That small movement told her everything. He was not asking because he wanted to understand. He was asking because he was already afraid of the answer. "I thought you knew me better than that," she said. Silas did not respond. The silence between them became heavier than any argument. The next morning, rumors spread through town. Some people said Eira had planned everything from the beginning. Others said Silas had finally discovered what everyone expected. The ranch workers did not believe the rumors. Not all of them. Bram, Corwin, and Merritt remembered every small thing Eira had done. They remembered how she saved money from the kitchen budget to buy better medicine for injured workers. They remembered how she stayed awake when one of the horses was sick. They remembered how she learned everyone's names instead of calling them by their jobs. People could pretend to care for a day, but not for months. Not in the way Eira had. Bram went to Silas. The old ranch hand did something very few people had ever done. He disagreed with him. "You are making a mistake." Silas looked at him. "You think I don't know how to handle my own problems?" "No," Bram answered. "I think you know exactly how to handle problems. That is the problem." Silas remained silent. Bram continued. "You know how to fight enemies. You know how to protect money. You know how to protect land." He paused. "But you don't know how to protect something good." Those words stayed with Silas, because he knew Bram was not trying to disrespect him. He was trying to remind him of something. A person could lose something valuable while trying too hard not to lose it. Meanwhile, Eira packed her things. She did not leave immediately. She waited because she wanted one honest conversation with Silas, not as his wife, not as the woman everyone was questioning, just as the person who had shared his home. That evening, she found him outside near the old barn, the place where they had first talked alone after their wedding. "You believe I did it," she said. Silas did not answer. That was enough. Eira nodded slowly. "I never asked you to trust me because I was your wife." She looked at the barn. "I asked you to trust me because I was the same person before and after I married you." Silas looked at her. For the first time, he saw the damage his silence had caused. Not because she was angry, because she had stopped trying to convince him. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted. Eira nodded. "That is the part that hurts." She picked up her bag. "You were not supposed to know everything about me on the first day. Nobody does." She looked back at him. "But after everything we lived together, I thought I had earned the chance to be heard." Silas wanted to stop her, but pride and fear held him in place. Eira left the main house and moved into the small guest cottage near the edge of the property. She did not return to town. She did not tell anyone her plans. She simply needed space. The workers noticed the difference immediately. Meals became quiet again. The kitchen became organized but empty. The laughter that had slowly appeared around the ranch disappeared. Silas noticed it too. The house was returning to what it had been before. Large, clean, silent. And for the first time, he understood that Eira had not changed the ranch because of her cooking. She had changed it because she made people feel seen. 3 days passed. Then something unexpected happened. Pelham Wexley came to Silas with new information. He had reviewed the records again. This time he noticed something he had missed. The altered payments had not been made from the main office. They had been changed from an old storage room where archived documents were kept, a place where only a few people had access. Silas immediately understood. The evidence against Eira was not just false. It had been carefully created. Someone wanted him to doubt her. The question was who? That same day, Bram remembered something. 2 weeks before the first missing shipment, he had seen a stranger near the storage building. A man asking questions. A man who knew too much about the ranch. When Bram described him, Silas already knew the name. Thaddeus Marlowe. The past he thought he had left behind had returned. Silas rode into town alone. He found Thaddeus at a small office near the train station. The conversation was not long. Silas did not shout. He did not threaten him. He simply placed the documents on the table. "You wanted me to believe she betrayed me." Thaddeus smiled. "Did it work?" Silas said nothing, because the answer was complicated. For a moment, it had worked. That was the part that bothered him. Not only that someone tried to destroy his marriage, but that his own fears helped them. Thaddeus leaned back. "You really think she changed you?" Silas looked at him. "No." Thaddeus smiled. "You still don't understand." Silas waited. "She changed the way people saw you." Those words bothered him, because they were true. For years, Silas had built a reputation around being untouchable, but Eira had shown people another side of him, a side he had hidden even from himself. Silas returned to the ranch that evening. He went directly to the cottage. Eira opened the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Silas said the one thing he had avoided saying. "I was wrong." Eira looked at him, not because she wanted an apology, because she needed honesty. "I believed the first thing that made sense with my fears," he continued. "I looked for proof that I was right instead of looking for the truth." Eira stayed quiet. Silas lowered his voice. "I don't expect you to forget that." She looked away. "Good." He accepted the answer, because he knew forgiveness was not something he could demand. It was something he had to earn. The next days would decide whether their marriage could survive, because discovering the truth was only the first step. Repairing the damage was another. Silas did not expect things to return to normal after apologizing. He knew an apology could open a door, but it could not force someone to walk through it. For years, he had solved problems with decisions. If there was a business issue, he fixed it. If there was a disagreement, he ended it. If someone betrayed him, he removed them from his life. But Eira was not a business problem. She was not someone he could dismiss or control. She was the person who had trusted him when almost everyone else only feared him, and he had failed her. The next morning, Silas did something that surprised the entire ranch. He called all the workers together. Everyone gathered near the main barn. Bram stood with his arms crossed. Corwin looked confused. Merritt waited quietly. Silas rarely spoke in front of everyone unless there was a problem. That morning, he admitted there was one. "I accused someone without knowing the truth," he said. The men looked at each other. They had never heard him speak that way. "I allowed suspicion to guide my actions. That was my mistake." Nobody interrupted. Silas continued. "Eira did nothing wrong." Those words mattered, not because the workers needed permission to respect her. They already did, but because they needed to see whether Silas was willing to admit when he was wrong. For many years, they had followed a man who never apologized. Now they saw something different, not weakness, responsibility. Later that day, Silas went to the kitchen. Eira was there preparing bread, the same way she had done many mornings before. The simple routine had returned, but something between them was still fragile. "I spoke with everyone," Silas said. Eira continued working. "What did you tell them?" "The truth." She looked at him. "And what about me?" Silas understood the question. She was not asking if he defended her reputation. She was asking if he understood what he had broken. "I hurt your trust," he said. Eira looked down at the dough. Yes, there was no anger in her voice. That made it harder. Anger could be answered. Pain required patience. I spent years believing that if I never depended on anyone, nobody could disappoint me, Silas said. Eira remained quiet, but I never considered that I could become the person who disappoints someone else. That was the first time she saw him admit something without trying to protect his pride. It did not erase what happened, but it mattered. I don't need you to become someone else overnight, Eira said. Silas listened. I need you to remember that trust is not something you ask for, only when you need it. He nodded. I understand. And this time, she believed that he was trying to. The situation with Thaddeus Marlowe was not finished. Silas knew that. A man like Thaddeus did not disappear after losing one plan. He had lost the chance to destroy Silas's marriage, but he still had connections and information. The difference was that Silas no longer wanted to handle everything alone. He began asking questions. Not ordering, asking. He listened to Bram, he listened to Pelham, he listened to the workers who had been with him for years. That change was noticed. Small changes, the kind that people rarely talk about. He started eating dinner with the workers once a week. He stopped making decisions without hearing from the people affected by them. He even repaired the old dining room at the ranch because Eira had mentioned that the workers deserved a proper place to rest after long days outside. But not everyone accepted the changes. Some people preferred the old Silas, the one who was easier to understand, the one who ruled through distance. One of those people was Orvin Sayer. After Thaddeus's plan failed, Orvin became nervous. He knew too much. He knew about the altered documents. He knew about the missing supplies, and he knew Thaddeus would not protect him if things went wrong. So Orvin made a decision. He went to Silas. The meeting happened near the old storage building, the same place where the false evidence had been created. Orvin looked older than Silas remembered. I need to tell you something. Silas waited. Orvin explained. Everything. How Thaddeus paid him. How the documents were changed. How they used old information about Eira to make the lie believable. Silas listened without interrupting. When Orvin finished, he asked one question. Why are you telling me now? Orvin looked away. Because I realized something. What? You were not the only person who changed. Silas studied him. Orvin continued. When I worked here before, I thought you only respected strong people. He paused. But Eira made this place different. Silas did not answer. Because he understood. People had changed around him because someone showed them a different way to live. Not through force. Through example. The information was enough to expose Thaddeus. But Silas made another decision that surprised everyone. He did not seek revenge. He had spent too many years believing that every enemy needed to be defeated. Now he wanted something else. He wanted to stop repeating the same cycle. Thaddeus was reported to the authorities. With the evidence, the matter was handled through the law. For some people in town, that was disappointing. They expected a confrontation. They expected Silas Crowe to react the way he always had. But the man who walked into the courthouse was not exactly the same man who had built Blackthorn Ranch. He no longer needed everyone to fear him. After everything ended, life slowly returned to normal. But normal was different now. Eira did not immediately move back into the main house. She stayed in the cottage for several more weeks. Silas respected that. He visited often, not to ask her to forgive him, not to pressure her, just to talk. Sometimes they discussed the ranch. Sometimes they discussed simple things. The weather, the horses, the books Eira liked to read, the small conversations they had before everything happened. Silas learned that rebuilding trust was not a single moment. It was many small moments repeated over time. One morning, months later, Eira walked back into the main house carrying her old recipe book. Silas noticed. He did not say anything at first. He simply moved aside and gave her space. She placed the book on the kitchen table. I think I will make breakfast today. Silas smiled slightly. That sounds good. The ranch hands noticed her return. Nobody celebrated loudly. That was not their way. But when dinner arrived that evening, every worker was at the table. The same men who once preferred eating in town now chose to stay at the ranch. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. And that difference meant more than anyone outside the ranch could understand. Years later, people in the valley still talked about Blackthorn Ranch. Some remembered Silas as the man who built a business from nothing. Others remembered the rumors, the arguments, the conflicts. But the people who worked there remembered something else. They remembered a woman who arrived without wealth or influence, a woman who changed a place by paying attention to people. And they remembered a man who learned that being strong did not mean never making mistakes. It meant having the courage to admit them. Because in the end, the greatest legacy Silas left behind was not the land. It was the lesson that power could build walls, but trust was what built a home. The months after Thaddeus Marlowe's arrest were not easy for Blackthorn Ranch. The danger had passed, but the consequences remained. People often believed that once the truth appeared, everything returned to the way it was before. That was not what happened. The truth could remove a lie, but it could not erase the days when people were hurt by it. Silas understood that better than anyone. Every morning he woke up earlier than before, not because he had more work, because he had become used to thinking. Before Eira came into his life, he filled every quiet moment with business. There was always another contract, another problem, another decision. Now, he noticed things he had ignored for years. The sound of the workers talking near the barn, the way the horses reacted when familiar people approached, the small repairs around the house that nobody had ever bothered to fix. He realized that for a long time, he had been present everywhere on the ranch except in the lives of the people who were there with him. One afternoon, Bram found him repairing a broken fence post. The old ranch hand stopped and watched. "You know there are people hired to do that," Bram said. Silas looked at the damaged wood. "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" Silas placed the hammer down for a moment. "Because I can." Bram smiled slightly. "That would have sounded different coming from you a year ago." Silas looked at him. "How?" "Before, it would have meant you didn't need anyone." Bram looked at the fence. "Now it sounds like you are simply helping." Silas did not answer, but he understood the difference. For years he believed independence meant refusing help. Eira had shown him that sometimes accepting others was part of becoming stronger. Meanwhile, Eira slowly returned to her place in the ranch. Not as someone trying to prove herself, not as someone trying to fix everything. She simply lived. She continued cooking. She continued helping the workers. But she also made time for herself. She started keeping a journal with recipes, notes, and memories from the ranch. Not because she thought anyone would read it. She wanted to remember the details. The first morning she arrived, the first time, the workers sat together for dinner. The arguments she and Silas had, the lessons they learned. She knew people often remembered the big events, but life was mostly made of small ones. One evening Silas found her writing. "What are you recording?" She closed the notebook halfway. "Things I don't want to forget." He sat nearby. "Like what?" She smiled. "The day Corwin finally admitted he liked the apple pie." Silas laughed quietly. "That was a serious event." It was. He spent 3 months pretending he didn't care. They both laughed. It was a simple moment. But for Silas it meant more than any celebration, because laughter had returned to his home. Not forced, not planned, real. However, not everyone in town accepted the changes. Some people believed Silas had become softer. They saw kindness as weakness. One of those people was a businessman named Garrick Voss. Garrick had always respected the old Silas, the man who never hesitated, the man who made decisions quickly. When Garrick visited Blackthorn Ranch to discuss a possible partnership, he noticed the difference immediately. The workers spoke more freely. Eira sat at the table during conversations. Silas asked questions before making choices. Garrick found it strange. "You used to be easier to work with," he said. Silas looked at him. "Because I didn't listen?" Garrick smiled. "Because you decided." Silas nodded. And that was not always the same as being right. The conversation ended differently than Garrick expected. Silas refused the partnership. Not because Garrick was an enemy, because the agreement would have harmed smaller ranch owners in the area. Years earlier, Silas would have accepted the opportunity. The money would have been enough. Now, he considered the consequences. That decision changed how people saw him. Not everyone approved, but more people respected him. Over time, Blackthorn Ranch became known for something different. Not just its size, not just its wealth. People talked about how workers stayed there for years, how families trusted sending relatives to work there, how the ranch treated people who had nowhere else to go. Eira never wanted recognition. Whenever someone praised her, she always said the same thing. I only treated people the way I hoped someone would treat me. Silas heard her say that many times, and every time he remembered the man he used to be, the man who thought respect came from being feared. One winter morning, years after their marriage, a young worker arrived at the ranch looking for employment. His name was Alden Price. He was nervous. He had little experience and almost no money. During the interview, Silas noticed something familiar. The young man kept apologizing, for asking questions, for needing time, for making mistakes. Silas recognized that behavior because he had once lived that way too. He hired him, not because he felt sorry for him, because he saw someone willing to learn. Alden eventually became one of the most trusted workers on the ranch. Years later, he would tell people that the opportunity changed his life, but Silas always corrected him. The opportunity was only the beginning. What you did with it was your choice. That became one of the phrases people remembered from him, because Silas never wanted people to believe success came from luck alone. He had learned that people needed chances, but they also needed responsibility. As time passed, the story of Eira and Silas became less about romance. The people who knew them understood that their marriage survived because both of them changed. Eira learned that patience had limits. She learned she could love someone and still expect respect. Silas learned that protecting his heart did not mean closing it. They were not a perfect couple. They argued. They disagreed. They had difficult conversations, but they stopped running away from them. And that was the difference. One spring, many years later, the ranch held a small gathering for the workers and their families. There were no expensive decorations, no speeches prepared, just food, conversations, and people sitting together. Eira looked around the table. Many of the faces had changed. Some workers had left. New ones had arrived. But the feeling remained. The ranch was no longer just a place where people worked. It had become a place where people belonged. Silas noticed her looking around. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Eira smiled. "I was thinking about the first night everyone stopped eating in town." Silas laughed. "I remember. They thought I was trying to control the ranch. They were wrong." She looked at him. "Yes." A pause followed. Then she added, "But they were right about one thing." "What?" "You changed." Silas looked at the people around them. He thought about the years behind him, the mistakes, the lessons, the things he almost lost because he was afraid to trust. "I think we both did." And that was the truth. Neither of them became different people. They simply became better versions of who they already were. The story of Blackthorn Ranch continued to be told. But over time, people stopped focusing on the rumors. The town had a habit of remembering scandals longer than kindness. That was true everywhere. A mistake could become a person's identity if people allowed it. But the people who had lived at the ranch knew the full story. They knew about the difficult days. They knew about the accusations. They knew about the moment when trust almost disappeared. And they knew that what came after mattered more. Silas never forgot what happened. Not because he wanted to punish himself, because he understood that some lessons only remain when a person chooses to remember them. Years later, he still kept the false documents from Thaddeus Marlowe, not as a reminder of an enemy, as a reminder of himself. He stored them in a small wooden box in his office. Eira once asked him why he kept something connected to such a painful moment. Silas answered honestly, "Because the person who hurt me was not the only person responsible for what happened." Eira understood what he meant. Thaddeus had created the lie, but Silas had allowed fear to make him believe it. That was the part he never wanted to forget. The ranch continued growing, but differently than before. Silas no longer measured success only by profit. He started helping younger ranch owners in the valley, not by giving away everything. He was still a businessman, but he started sharing knowledge, how to manage money, how to avoid bad agreements, how to plan for difficult seasons. Some people found it strange. The old Silas Crowe had protected every advantage he had. The new Silas understood that knowledge became more valuable when it helped others. Eira supported these changes. She often reminded him that a person's legacy was not built by what they kept. It was built by what remained after they were gone. One afternoon, A visitor arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, an older woman named Lenora Vale. She had known Silas when he was younger, before the money, before the reputation, before people started whispering his name. Silas recognized her immediately. "Why are you here?" he asked. Lenora smiled. "To see if the stories are true." Silas looked confused. "What stories?" "That you became a different man." He laughed softly. "People exaggerate." Lenora looked toward the house. "Maybe, but I can see enough." During their conversation, Lenora told him something he never expected. Years before, when Silas was struggling and trying to build his first business, many people believed he would fail. He had worked long hours. He had made mistakes. He had lost opportunities. But there was one thing people remembered. He always paid his workers on time, even when he had to delay his own plans. Silas had forgotten that part of himself. He had spent so many years protecting what he built that he forgot why he built it. He wanted security. But somewhere along the way, security became isolation. That conversation stayed with him. That evening, he told Eira about Lenora. "She reminded me of someone I used to be." Eira looked at him. "Someone you lost?" Silas thought about it. "No." He smiled. "Someone I found again." Their marriage continued through ordinary days. That was something they both appreciated. People often imagined that love was proven through important moments, big decisions, difficult challenges, but they discovered something else. Love was also in ordinary things. The cup of coffee prepared before the other person woke up, the question about how the day went, the habit of sitting together after dinner, even when there was nothing important to discuss. Those small actions became their foundation. Many years after Eira first arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, one of the younger workers asked Bram about her. Was she really the reason things changed here? Bram smiled. "That depends on what you mean." The young man looked confused. Bram continued. "She didn't change the ranch by herself." "Then what did she do?" "She reminded people that they could choose differently." That answer stayed with the young worker, because it was true. Eira did not arrive with a plan to transform anyone. She did not give speeches. She did not demand respect. She simply treated people with dignity, and people responded to that. Silas often thought about how different his life would have been if he had never met her. He might have become richer, maybe more powerful, but he knew he would have been poorer in ways money could not measure. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset over the fields, Eira asked him a question. "Do you ever regret anything?" Silas took his time answering. "Yes." She waited. "I regret the moments when I was too afraid to trust." Eira looked at him. "Anything else?" He shook his head. "No." She smiled. "Not even the difficult parts?" Silas looked toward the ranch. "The difficult parts taught us something." He paused. "But I would never choose to hurt you just to learn the lesson." That was one of the things Eira appreciated about him. He did not romanticize pain. He did not pretend mistakes were necessary. He simply accepted that they happened and tried to become better because of them. Years continued passing. The ranch saw good seasons and difficult ones. There were storms. There were financial problems. There were moments when decisions were uncertain. But the difference was that Silas no longer faced those moments alone. He had people around him. People who spoke honestly. People who disagreed when needed. People who cared about the result. That was something he had never planned. But it became his greatest achievement. Not the land. Not the business. Not the reputation. The people. Near the end of his life, Silas spent more time walking around the ranch. He knew every corner. The old barn. The garden Eira planted. The dining room where workers once stopped eating in town because they preferred staying home. He often stopped there and remembered the beginning. How strange it was that a simple meal could change the direction of so many lives. But maybe it was never about the food. Maybe it was about what happened around the table. People talking. People listening. People feeling like they mattered. And that was something Silas understood better than anyone. A person could own thousands of acres and still have nothing if nobody felt they belonged beside them. The final years of Silas Crowe's life were quieter than the years people remembered. There were no more enemies trying to destroy him. No more rumors strong enough to shake the ranch. No more need to prove that he was the most powerful man in the valley. For the first time in many years, Silas was simply living. He woke up each morning knowing the people around him were there because they wanted to be, not because they were afraid. Not because they depended on his money, because they respected the person he had become. That was something he valued more than anything he had built. Eira noticed the difference. The man she first met was always thinking about the next problem, the next risk, the next person who might betray him. The man beside her years later was different. He still planned. He still worked hard. But he also knew when to stop. He knew when to sit down and enjoy a quiet afternoon. He knew when to listen. He knew when an apology mattered more than being right. Those changes were not made in one day. They came through years of small choices. That was what made them real. One morning, Silas walked into the kitchen and found Eira looking through her old recipe book. The pages were worn. Some corners were folded. Some notes were written beside the recipes. He picked it up carefully. "You still have this?" Eira smiled. "I told you. These are memories." Silas turned the pages. There were notes about the first meals she prepared at Blackthorn Ranch. Notes about what the workers liked. Notes about special occasions, small details, things most people would forget. "You saved everything," he said. Eira looked at him. "Someone has to remember the little things." Silas nodded, because he finally understood. The little things were never little. They were the parts of life people carried with them. The ranch continued after them. That was the natural way of things. People arrived, people left. New generations learned the same lessons in different ways. Alden Price eventually became one of the managers of Blackthorn Ranch. When younger workers asked him why the ranch was different from others, he always gave the same answer. Because the people here learned that a person is more than the work they do. That idea came from Eira and from Silas. A lesson created through mistakes, not perfection. Years after Eira first arrived, a young woman visiting the ranch asked her something. "How did you make everyone respect you?" Eira smiled. "I didn't." The young woman looked surprised. "Then how did it happen?" "I respected them first." That answer was simple, but it explained everything. Eira never tried to become important. She simply made people feel important, and that changed the way they saw themselves. The story of the plain bride who cooked for the ranch hands became something people repeated over time. But many people misunderstood the real meaning. They thought the story was about a woman winning over a group of workers. It was not. It was about a man who learned that strength was not only about control, it was about trust. Silas had spent years building walls around himself. He thought those walls protected him, but they also kept out the people who wanted to stand beside him. Eira did not break those walls. She showed him he could open the door himself. That was the difference. Years later, when people visited Blackthorn Ranch, they saw the results of that lesson. They saw a place where workers sat together after long days, where decisions were discussed, where people were treated with respect. They saw a ranch. But those who knew the history saw something more. They saw the result of two people choosing to grow, not because they were forced, because they understood that a person's life is shaped by the choices they make when nobody is watching. The last conversation Silas and Eira had about the past happened on a quiet evening outside their home. They sat together watching the fields, the same fields where so many years of their lives had passed. Silas looked at her. "Do you remember the first day you arrived?" Eira smiled. "Yes. I thought you were going to leave." She laughed softly. "I almost did." Silas nodded. "I know." A long silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that happens when two people have shared enough years to not need constant words. Finally, Silas said, "I used to think I needed to build something nobody could take away." Eira looked at him. "And now?" He looked toward the ranch. "Now I think the things that matter most are the things we help build in other people." Eira held his hand. That was the lesson that remained. Not the money, not the land, not the reputation, the people, the trust, the moments that seemed ordinary, but became unforgettable. Silas Crowe's name remained connected to Blackthorn Ranch for many years, but those who truly knew the story did not remember him because he was wealthy. They remembered him because he changed. And they remembered Eira because she never needed wealth or power to make a difference. She arrived with simple belongings and a belief that people deserved respect. That was enough. Before finishing this story, there is something worth thinking about. Many people spend their lives trying to build something that proves their value. A business, a reputation, a position. But sometimes the greatest legacy is not what we achieve alone. It is the way people feel after they have known us. The people we helped, the trust we created, the kindness we showed when nobody was rewarding us for it. If this story of Silas and Eira made you reflect on the importance of trust, change, and the small actions that shape a life, share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to know what part of this story stayed with you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Wildwood Hearts, leave a like, and share it with someone who might appreciate this message. Thank you for staying until the end. Remember that every person carries a story that others may never see. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with simple choices: listening, admitting mistakes, and treating people with respect. A legacy is not only built by what we leave behind, it is built by what we leave inside the lives of others. Thank you for watching Wildwood Hearts.